I decided to rip out my old Mitre station for two reasons. Firstly, I wanted to move it along this wall by about 2 feet, and also I want to make it a little bit less deep so it's slimmer against the wall, and it'll open up a bit more space into the central area where my new table saw stand and workbench will be. So this is the old Mitre station in pieces, and some of this stuff I'm going to reuse for the new Mitre station.
I started by ripping down the worktop by about 10 centimetres. Not much, but in such a small space every little helps. Next I attached a batten to the wall. I used a pine bed slat for this, screwed into the uprights, and a spirit level to make sure it was straight. Then I attached another piece of wood using glue and screws. This would give me something to screw into from below to secure the worktop. I cut the worktop to the new length that I wanted it to be using a circular saw and a straight edge. Next I ripped a couple of pieces of salvaged plywood to size on the table saw and the circular saw again. These two panels would support each side of the worktop. I positioned everything where I wanted it and made some reference marks with a Sharpie onto the worktop. I then made some cuts with the jigsaw so that I could fit the worktop neatly around the uprights up against the wall. Next I secured the worktop to the back cleat from below with a few screws. Then I measured up for the bottom panel. I propped up the front of the worktop with a temporary support to enable me to remove the side panels again. I cut some more salvaged plywood to size with the circular saw for the bottom panel. I had a couple of thin strips of plywood that I'd ripped to 5 centimetres wide and cut to the same length as the bottom panel. I applied glue to one edge of each piece and positioned them underneath the bottom panel at the front and at the back, and pinned them in place from the top. These thin strips would elevate the bottom panel off the floor slightly and act as a kickboard. Next I glued and screwed the bottom panel to the side panels using a speed square to keep them at 90 degrees. And then I could slide it back in underneath the worktop. Next I wanted to start work on the shelf that would sit inside the unit. I'd already cut another piece of salvaged plywood to length. I positioned it inside and again made some reference marks to cut away for the uprights with the jigsaw. I cut some more smaller pieces of salvaged plywood to size, which would be upright dividers that would also support the central shelf in the centre. These were screwed to the shelf again using a speed square to keep them at 90 degrees to the shelf. Then I moved this piece of the structure back underneath the worktop. And secured it to the side panels with screws. To secure the dividers at the bottom, I used a simple pocket hole jig. I clamped it in place, drilled the holes, and then added screws. To secure the worktop to the front of the side panels, I used a couple of these angled brackets. Then I could load up the shelves with my power tools and scraps of wood. Next I ripped some 10mm strips of poplar on the table saw. And I used these strips to trim the plywood edges using glue and brad nails just to tidy up the look of the unit. And that was the shelving part of the Mitre station complete.
So today I need to build something for the Mitre saw to sit on in between these two uprights. So the first thing I need to do is measure the distance between the bed of the Mitre saw and the bottom. And to do that, I'm going to lay a straight edge on the table, and then I can use the calipers to measure the distance. And that's 96.23mm.
With the calipers still set to just over 96mm, I used them to scribe a reference line onto the side panel. I had some of this 1-inch thick melamine, and I'd use this to make a top for the Mitre saw to sit on. I clamped a straight edge to it and cut it to size with a circular saw. Next I used a couple of scrap pieces of pine to make a couple of cleats that would support the shelf. I drilled some pilot holes at the drill press table.
I've got a cleat cut to size and pilot holes drilled in it, ready to support the left hand side of the shelf that the Mitre saw will sit on. And I need to position this underneath the reference line I've made by the thickness of the shelf. And I've got an offcut here, so I'm going to use that to help me position it right where I want it.
I added glue and held the cleat in place temporarily with a couple of brad nails, and then added some screws to secure it. Next I rested the top shelf on the cleat and made some reference marks again, so that I could make some cuts with the jigsaw and fit the shelf nicely around the uprights of the workshop walls. Then I measured up the height of the cleat as accurately as possible and cut another piece of salvaged plywood to size on the table saw. This piece would support the right hand side of the unit that the Mitre saw will sit on. I positioned everything and attached the left hand side of the top to the cleat to secure it in place on one side.
Now I'm going to position the Mitre saw just to check and see how flush I've got this. At the moment the straight edge is resting on the right hand side of the Mitre saw table and the left hand side of the worktop. And in the middle I've got a gap of around 3mm. So that means I need to take a few millimeters off this right hand side panel. I'm going to use a scrap of wood to prop this up while I make the adjustment.
I made a reference line a couple of millimeters from the top edge with a pencil.
I took a couple of millimeters off with a hand plane up to the reference line that I'd made, and now I'm going to swap the panel over with this temporary support and see how it is now. That looks pretty good now, but it's not the easiest thing to see, so what I'm going to do is use a bit of paper to slide under and see if I've got any more gaps. I can definitely slide a piece of paper in there, and at this end I can't. So now I'm going to try 2 layers of paper, and I can get that under there as well. So now I'll try 4 layers of paper. That fits as well. So now I'll try 6 layers of paper, and that's very tight. So I think that's the thickness that I need to compensate for. So here is the 6 layers of paper. and that measures just under 0.5 millimetre. So now I'm going to take a fraction more off this right hand side panel. Cannot get 4 sheets under. Can't get 3 sheets under either. But I can get 2 sheets under. So now I'm 0.16 millimetres off. I've taken a few more shavings off. And hopefully this will be the last attempt. Can no longer get 2 under. 1 is very tight. Good enough for me. Going to use a couple of clamps here just so this doesn't move around.
I attached the other cleat to the right hand side panel with glue and screws.